Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Adam Golov, Marketing Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know we'll allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. So please write your questions in the chat area if they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we'll make them available on our website. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. Next slide, please. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. Next slide, please. We serve a very broad client base. Next slide, please. Spanning all industries. Next slide, please. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Bill Swallow, Director of Operations at Scriptorium. Bill specializes in content strategy with an emphasis on handling challenging localization and terminology scenarios. With 2 decades in technical communication, Bill has extensive experience in technology implementation, localization, and management. His experience on both the client and vendor side of localization has made him rather painfully aware of all the potential pitfalls in content localization, from technology to considerations to workflows to writing practices. Without further ado, welcome Bill.
Thanks, Adam. Hi, everybody. And as Adam said, I work for Scriptorium Publishing. I'm the Director of Operations there. And just a little bit more about who we are and what we do. We're located down in the Research Triangle Park area, North Carolina, although I work remotely up in upstate New York. And a lot of our clients are varied. We have people in software, manufacturing, medical, education, you name it. And they all seem to have the same problem, and that's that they need to do more with their content. So we help them with putting together content strategies, localization strategies, and assist with a lot of the implementation work along the way. So speaking of content strategy, I thought I'd begin with just a boiled down definition of what we mean when we talk about content strategy, because there are a lot of definitions out there. But when we talk about it, we're talking about the planning for and governance of the content lifecycle. So how content is created, who it's created for, the technology that's used to put it together, the publishing, the management of that, and of course, putting in the localization workflows as well. And when we talk about the Internet of Things, there are a lot of definitions out there, but they all boil down to connecting devices and software to provide greater value. So not only do these various devices talk to each other and use information passed from one system to another, but they relay a lot of information to people. So in some cases, one device will inform what another device does or what another device shows a person. In other cases, it'll keep passing information on or just provide information and not necessarily display it. So when we talk about the content strategy of things, it's kind of putting those 2 definitions together, and you get something that looks like the planning for and governance of connected content to provide greater value. And really, with any strategy, of course, the planning is absolutely essential. You have to have a plan and a process in place, and usually that entails multiple plans, multiple processes, because you have multiple people involved, whether it be writers or engineers, developers, designers, translators, and all of these people need to understand all of the associated systems and the users. It's absolutely critical that you have this understanding, and it's not just you performing your small role and in a bubble. You really need to understand how everyone needs to understand how their work impacts everyone else in order to do this right. And this absolutely includes all the localization factors that go into play and the cultural understanding of the audiences that are interacting with this content that's being fed through these various devices. Pardon me. So when thinking about how to support the Internet of Things, Maslow's hierarchy of needs comes to mind, and Sarah O'Keefe actually put this together as a hierarchy of content needs. So whereas Maslow's, you start at the bottom with psychological needs, followed by safety, belonging and love, esteem, and self-actualization, the content needs start with content being available, and then accurate, and then appropriate for those people. And then you get to connected and intelligent at the top. So there's a concept out there called minimally viable content, and that really has to do with the lower three portions of this pyramid. Basically meaning that your content's available, it's accurate, it's concise, it's complete, it's delivered in all of the formats that you need it to be delivered in. It's delivered in all the languages that it needs to be delivered in, and it's being delivered on time. So that would be what we would consider minimally viable. It's what you need to produce. But the Internet of Things requires a bit more, actually a lot more. Your content also needs to be connected, and that's not only connected with people and being that it's engaging, but also it needs to be connected mechanically or programmatically so that this content can be shared. And to do so, you really need to have, it needs to be intelligent. So by intelligent, what do we mean? So Anne Rockley first coined this term, and it boils down to really 5 key criteria that need to be in place for content to be intelligent. So it needs to be structurally rich, which means that there needs to be some rules around how the content is constructed, how it's written, where it lies in relation to other bits of content. It needs to be semantically rich, which means that it needs to be tagged with metadata, really rich metadata that really give the content additional context and purpose. So that it's more than just, this is a paragraph, but it could be that this is a summary, for example, which still could be a paragraph, but actually has a specific tag. Within those tags, you can also have things called attributes. And in that case, you could say that this is a summary targeted for one specific type of audience, for example. The content needs to be reusable, and to do so, it needs to be written in finite chunks of information, and each one can be given a unique ID that can be referenced and reused wherever needed. The content needs to be reconfigurable, which means that these finite chunks of information can be moved around however you need to move them. They can be pulled in, pulled out, and that really speaks to it being adaptable. So it can be delivered in many different ways, in whole, in part. It could be conditional, so in some cases you'd see a particular piece of content, in some cases not. And when you think of all this, essentially you're looking at some kind of XML-based content. And one good example of this is SNOMED CT. And without getting into too much information about this, because you could go on for years talking about this, I'm going to provide a link at the end of this presentation if you do want more information about this particular model. But this is multilingual clinical healthcare terminology. And it's comprehensive, it's scientifically validated clinical content. Everything that's in there is extremely consistent. It's machine processable, and it represents all of the terminology that's used in healthcare records. And all of these, this entire model can be mapped to many other international standards as well. So this particular model uses that semantically rich, controlled clinical vocabulary. And it includes a whole bunch of information around each medical concept. So you have terms, synonyms for those terms, translations, definitions, etc. And everything in there is extremely specific and accurate. For example, there's a common term, you probably heard it, called blood clot. So if someone's having heart issues and so forth, they might go in and the doctor might say, you have a blood clot. Well, this is clinically defined as a coronary thrombosis. And even though the doctor may relay it in basic term as a blood clot, they may enter it either as the coronary thrombosis, or they might actually put it in as a coronary occlusion. And these are two other terms that are related. And what SNOMED CT does is it allows those relationships to be understood by the system so that the doctor doesn't have to be as specific as possible. The system recognizes one term and maps it to another. And it does this through a rather interesting model. So every single concept, so blood clot, has a unique ID. And these IDs and concepts are broken down into descriptions and relationships. So each description has a fully specified name. So that's the clinical approved name. And then there are a bunch of common names and phrases or synonyms for each term and in each language. And then you have these relationships. You have an is-a relationship, which is a computer understandable relationship link. And that links out to other related concepts which have other IDs and further drill down that way. And there are also attributes. And these attributes are related information that's specific to that particular concept. So when we think of the Internet of Things, the SNOMED really does seem to be at least one really successful model that can be applied to producing content for the Internet of Things. So you still have that single concept with a unique ID, and you have all these other systems and people, each with their own descriptions and relationships that they understand. And at some point, all those correlations can be drawn either programmatically or by deduction, if it's a human doing it. So why talk about this? Well, we have a wide variety of ways that we're delivering content currently. You have your traditional books, you have your online content as well. You might be producing stuff for e-readers, for tablets, for phones, but then you also have additional platforms that are starting to be used, like smart watches, all of the different home appliances such as Echo or Google Home. And then you have all of the smart appliances that are out there, smart thermostats, smart alarm systems, refrigerators even, you name it. So all of these appliances and such are starting to store content and retrieve information and push information out. I've seen cases where you actually have refrigerators that can connect to your phone and give you an update if someone says we're out of milk at home and you're at the office. There's ways of connecting that and being able to send a message out as a reminder. So really, when we're talking about all of this, it becomes critical that there be a separation of form and content when you're developing your content, especially for the Internet of Things. Reuse is absolutely critical, and so the best way to do this is with XML. You can tag the content both structurally and semantically, and let transforms dictate the actual look and feel for each delivery format. So for print, you pass some content through a transform to print, and it maps your XML tags to styles, and it gives it PostScript instruction on how to lay this information out, and you have your pretty document at the end. Likewise, for the web or for a tablet or for mobile, you usually have something that's more HTML based, but they're not always HTML. Sometimes you can be rendering in, for example, JSON or something else with some kind of cascading style sheet behind it. But the point is that you're mapping these semantic tags over to something that is visually or audibly tagged and understood by whatever is going to be rendering that content. So this way you're not worrying about formatting on the source side. But we're not really talking about pushing all the same content everywhere, because it's certainly not appropriate. So what fits on a computer screen likely won't fit on a phone screen. And if you've tried using PDFs on your phone, although it is possible, they are incredibly difficult to read. A lot of times I find myself pinching and zooming and panning all over the place just to read a PDF on my phone. And don't even ask me why I've tried reading PDFs on my phone. It's just, things that people provide. Going to a restaurant's website, for example, most of the menus that are out there are in PDF format, and they are incredibly difficult to read on a cell phone. Buttons and other limited UI items, we have that limited amount of space. You have to account for text expansion and text contraction when you're localizing for all of these different interfaces, different layouts. You have right to left, left to right issues as well in place. And but the important point is to design to meet the expectations of where this content is going, not set the expectations. So if we look at the model again, we have a content piece or concept with an ID, and it has a whole bunch of different relationships built in, a whole bunch of different attributes, different descriptions, short names, functions, meaning, instructions, related information. And you can see that once we start putting all of this information together with a unique ID, we can start pushing some of this content out to, the majority of content out to the web, for example. We could push very small bits of content related to this particular concept out to a smartwatch. And likewise, we could push other related information out to a phone. Maybe not all the information that's going to the web. Maybe it's just a few bits of that info. But once you start having this model in place, it's very easy to be able to identify the particular bits of content that need to go to specific devices. Now, I mentioned SNOMED as an example because there really is no hard governance about how this content needs to be created and distributed. There is governance, fortunately, around the Internet of Things with regard to security, but with regard to information development, it's wide open, and that's unfortunate that there's no single model to apply, but it's fortunate because there's a way to get there from many different starting points. But you have to have intelligent content to get there, which at least allows people to respond to all the different needs that their targets need. So since there isn't any formal content governance, content strategy really is absolutely critical. You need to have a very clear idea about how to structure and tag and shepherd all this content through the life cycle and make sure that it's all going to the right places, and that all audiences are going to receive what they need in the language that they need it in, that it's conceptually relevant, that's contextually relevant, and that is as complete as can be for that target. You don't want to have a dictionary or encyclopedia entry coming up on a smartwatch, but you want to be able to provide as much information as possible given that limited real estate and the use case for that device. So when planning your strategy, it really makes sense to start at the end and work your way backwards. So what devices are you supporting? What are those requirements and limitations? Who's using these devices, and how are they going to be using them? What are the use cases around how these things are being used, and what do people actually need out of them? What languages need to be supported? What cultural issues might you face going into certain markets? Certainly, some information might be required, even on varying devices in some locations, and in others not so much. It might not be important. Or how that information is presented might need to be completely different based on where these people are. So being able to take a look at your end goals. Who are your audiences? What are the devices that are being used? And how does this content need to get there? And that will inform how you develop in content. It'll basically inform your entire information architecture at that point. And from there, you can then work backwards into, okay, who are all the people that are going to be developing and supporting this content? And let's get them all in a room and start putting this together. So at this point, single sourcing really is critical, and it's not necessarily, again, pushing everything out to everywhere, but being able to manage everything as much as possible in a single location will help you dramatically. Duplicate content sets get incredibly messy to maintain. So having it all centrally located where everyone has access, everyone doesn't need to have access to the entire lot of content, but making sure that everyone has access to the same repository in various ways to provide the information that they need to develop really becomes critical. And managing it all centrally ensures that no one is out there recreating the wheel, possibly inserting errors with bad copy paste, forgetting to update in 2 different areas, and so forth. And so the goal here really is to simplify that content development activity and specialize that content for various outputs and needs. And to do that, you need to start making those connections, understanding where and how your content is being used and by whom. I know I've talked with a lot of writers over the years, and many express that they don't necessarily have that thorough understanding of the audience and what they need. And I guess the mindset historically has been, we'll provide the information that we want people to have. That's being turned on its head now, where the users and the use cases and the target devices and those use cases are starting to define how the content needs to be put together, and it really starts defining what that content needs to ultimately look like. No longer, do we as content developers have carte blanche to do whatever we want with the content, because there could be some serious ramifications down the road. So being able to map out all of these connections, all the devices that are being supported, all of the people, where they're located, what they find is important, what they ultimately value, and being able to push this content out to them in a way that's meaningful. Noting any of the limitations, any of the special considerations and wants of those audiences. And back to governance again. The governance of your strategy needs to be rock solid. You need to document all of your decisions and all of your agreements with everyone who's involved. And again, this strategy can't take place in a vacuum. There's no one group that is going to be responsible for producing content for everything. So you may have, people from a technical writing department, from marketing, from engineering or development, technical support, and even your translators. They all need to be on board, and they all need to understand what the strategy is and what the goals of that strategy are. And of course, those goals, one, are to provide the information that needs to get out to all these different devices and different people, but it also needs to, at the end of the day, support your business goals as well. So the things that you might cover in your strategy boils down to style, process, systems that you're using, the tools that are interacting with those systems, the structure that you're going to be authoring in, the types of metadata that you're using to add that rich, meaningful context to the stored content, who authors what, and how content is being tagged and assembled, and also how it's being published and consumed by other systems. So you might never publish to to PDF or the web, but you have a publishing target that might be, you know, a particular database with its own particular semantic infrastructure in place. And you need to make sure that you can push your content to that system and have it be understood. And when putting together this strategy, I hate to say it, but you do have to lay down the law. It's not necessarily that you're going to rule with an iron fist, but you need to make sure that everyone understands what the goals are and what the strategy is, and how everyone contributes their part to the whole of that strategy. You're investing incredibly heavily in putting a strategy like this together, so you need to make sure that you govern this investment well. So the value of connectivity is that you have, you know, the shared content, you have this consistency built in place, you have all of these unique adaptations that you are planning for, and you're not approaching them in an ad hoc manner, you know, not translating on the fly and hoping it works, not deciding to get creative with how you're writing your content and hoping that the way you feel it's important is being, you know, measured equally by the consumer, but having that plan in place, and making sure that your content is always targeted. And any new target that you add, you have a solid base to work from already. So all the work that you've done, you know, if you then have a new requirement that comes down, you have the groundwork to be able to adapt to that new requirement. And so content, you know, connectivity, it's not a fad. You know, it's here to stay, and it's if anything, it's a growing need. We're going to see a lot more of this down the road, where devices are going to be talking to each other and passing information from one to another, eventually to a person, whether it be visually, whether it be in text, whether it be audio, or some other format that we haven't really seen yet. And I haven't taken a dive into virtual reality yet, but we're already starting to talk about that in conferences and so forth, where some people actually do develop content specifically for 3D virtual worlds and interfaces. So, you know, if anything, this need is expanding, and the best time to start planning for it is now, because, you know, it's no longer the future. The future is here, and we need to start getting ready for that. So I have a few additional resources here for you to peruse. There's on Scriptorium.com, we have a bunch of white papers and case studies that touch upon this content interoperability, how content is being developed to suit multiple needs and multiple targets and being consumed by multiple different systems. Again, there's the link for SNOMED if you need more information on that. Certainly that could be, you could spend hours reading up on that. It's actually, you know, if you're into metadata and you're into structured content and all of that, you'll probably be reading on there for hours. And if you're new to content strategy, a good place to get started is with Content Strategy 101, where you can start thinking about how to put your strategy together, how to get buy-in for that strategy, how to look at ROI and funding, and so forth. So I guess with that, I can open it up for questions.
Thank you, Bill. A very informative webinar indeed. We have several questions that have come in. The first being, would something more basic like Markdown work for the Internet of Things?
That's a good question. I would say yes and no. You can kind of get by with Markdown, but in a very limited way. Markdown, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's kind of a simplified version of creating content separate from its formatting. So it takes the principle of XML, but it doesn't have a lot of that semantic value built in. So it will ease the authoring because people don't necessarily need to know what tags they're using and so forth. It's a very quick way quick and dirty way of documenting things using some very basic formatting. But you lose, again, that critical, intelligent part to the content. So your approach there would be that you can repurpose what you create in Markdown, but you can't do all of the other things that you need to do if you're using intelligent content. So you wouldn't be able to conditionally swap content out, pull in specific chunks, bits and pieces, one paragraph from one topic to another that you can do with something more intelligent. But you can start with Markdown. So if you are working and you're not quite ready for everyone to move to some kind of XML-based format, you can have writers working in Markdown and then have a conversion that happens, and you pull that into XML, at which point then you can add all the semantically rich information. The only caveat there is that once you make that conversion, there's no easy way to go back to the Markdown. And if you update the Markdown copy, you have a couple of options. One is to have someone sit down and do a diff on the changes that took place in the Markdown from one version to another, and then hand key those changes in. That, of course, introduces human error into the process as you're updating the XML. Another is to completely reconvert the content to XML, but then you have to add all those semantic tags and attributes all over again, which is also time consuming. So, it's really a one-shot deal. If you are going to be moving to XML and you want to start authoring in Markdown, once you convert, I mean, the best practice there is to no longer touch the Markdown copy and only work within the stored XML.
Great.
I hope I answered that question.
Thank you. The next question that's come in is, we're not structured yet. What are some ways to get started?
So if you're not structured yet, the best way I think to start is to start by thinking structured and moving in that direction. So one of the things that is important to do at this point, and if you haven't done it yet, it's a good place to start, is to internationalize your content model or your content as much as possible. So, for example, if you're using unstructured FrameMaker, you have these templates, and the templates have master pages and so forth. If you can isolate all of that repeatable content and make sure that the templates are nailed down, that's a good place to start, because then you're focusing on just authoring the content and not worrying about all of the the headers, the footers, any other I don't want to say adorned text, but text that isn't part of the meat that you're writing. Another thing is to use an implied structure. So you may not have rigid structure, you may not have XML, but that doesn't mean that you can't use an implied structure. So being able to lock down your styles and your writing approach, and be able to say, if you're creating a procedure, these are the things you need. You need a heading, you need an intro statement, and then just start with the numbers. And being able to do this repeatedly. So it takes some of the creativity in writing away, but then again, the creativity just morphs into how you're going to really start approaching the writing in a systematic way. So it's kind of shifting the focus of that creativity and taking a more formulaic approach with authoring. And then once you have this consistent approach to your writing in place, if you are at that point ready to move to structured content, whatever format it may be, you're then better aligned for conversion because there's a consistency in how headings appear and how paragraphs are ordered, how lists are presented, and where they're presented in each topic or section of your document. And you know, someone like DCL can actually help with the conversion at that point. But also, it's also important, if you know, whether you're structured or not, it's important to start, if you haven't already, start managing your terminology, and not just having this approved list of terms and basic definitions, but being able to flesh that out and be able to have your absolute approved term to use, as well as a few acceptable replacements depending on the use case, and then having a list of terms that mean the same thing that you absolutely don't want people to use, and being able to document those different use cases, provide examples, and so forth, because at the end of the day, everyone needs to understand which terms to use when and how in order to build that consistency. And that gets even more important as you start looking at localization as well.
Great, thank you, Bill. The next question to come in is, akin to the W3C consortium, is there a central standard for the Internet of Things, given that you are talking XML and that this is open and extensible?
There's no, to my knowledge anyway, there is no framework that every single device manufacturer is using. And there's no real standard out there that says this is XML for the Internet of Things. There are many different XML-based formats that work with producing content for the Internet of Things, particularly if you get into a lot of the development environments. You know, so they'll have their own particular markup for content within that development environment. But as far as, you know, something like the W3C, where you have, you know, this governing body for HTML, there are many different flavors of XML out there, and each one does have a governing body, but there's no one. I guess there's no one ring to rule it all. to get geeky about it.
Great, thank you, Bill. The next question that's come in is, are there special considerations for translation?
Yes, and you know, really, there always are. Again, you know, looking at your content base, you know, it's critical that everything is internationalized as much as possible, and that means extracting all of the boilerplate text and repeatable text as much as you can, so that you can get it ready for translation. What that does is, one, it allows you to pre-translate a lot of that information, so translate it before the rest of your content gets translated. You know, so this could be something like, you know, your labels for notes, cautions, and warnings, any other boilerplate text that you might have in play that doesn't necessarily sit within the body text. But being able to pull all that information out, and then as you're authoring, particularly within XML, there's a concept of having what are called warehouse topics. And those are kind of laundry list topics that hold very specific types of information that is repeated very often throughout content, but isn't, you know, part of your actual, you know, output templates or labels or so forth. So you might have a warehouse topic full of just notes, and these notes might appear several different times in several different ways throughout, you know, let's say a website or, you know, a printed document or so forth, or even on, you know, your display items for, you know, your phone or your smartwatch. And then, you know, as you collect these things, you can translate them in one shot in one document, and they can be referenced in as needed everywhere else. So you're not translating the same text over and over and over again, or paying someone to review the same translated text over and over and over again. It's done once and inserted everywhere. Also, make sure that all of the targets that you're hitting, you may have your own specific language requirements, but there might be other ones out there. And there might be devices that you're integrating your content with that you don't directly build yourself. So you need to make sure that those devices handle all of the different language requirements that are out there. So supporting the various font sets that have the real estate for largely expanded text. If you're going to a German or Finnish or something like that, where the text is much longer than it would be in English. Likewise, being able to move to interfaces that use less text or less real estate for text. Being able to document any kind of space limitations that might be out there. So if your interface only allows for 20 characters for a particular string, making sure that translators know that ahead of time so that they understand not only the space limitations, but also provide them with some context around what that string means and where it appears in the user interface. It gives them more information to kind of get creative with the translation if the raw translation won't fit. So they might be able to think of a better term or know of a abbreviation that would work for that particular audience. It's really important, and this is kind of a contentious bit of advice, but it's important to work to own your own translation memory. So translation memory is of course a storage of all of the translations by pairs. So you have your source language and a target language, and it stores all of that information together. And there's a different, there's a different entry for every single language pair that you have. So being able to have access to that translation memory is important if you tend to bring on multiple different language vendors. You can make sure that they all work with the same translation memory. This way, you're not paying them to retranslate stuff that someone else has already translated before. They can all work within that memory and gain that leverage on their content. And when they're done, making sure that you get the updates from all of them and be able to store them and manage them in a central location. Now, a lot of language providers will do that for you and manage that for you. And I've seen a lot of companies go through one particular localization service provider, and that group will work independently with other translators and provide that translation for you, so that you don't have to understand what it means to own and manage your own machine translation, translation memory. But when you at the end of the day, it's nice to have your own copy. So should anything, if you need to change vendors, if you need to add additional vendors, if you need to clean it up, so if you see that there are bad translations or similar but different translations being used for the same text in English, for example, you can kind of go in and clean that up and make sure that everyone is using the same translations if they exist in that translation memory.
Great, thank you, Bill. The last question that has come in is, how do you recommend handling situations where the content strategy needs to change or people deviate from the strategy?
Well, hopefully people aren't deviating from the strategy for the sake of deviating from the strategy, that there are no rogues out there running around. But your content strategy is going to be fluid. It's a fluid thing, like a river. It's going to flow and it's going to change direction based on other factors, pushing against it. So it needs to be fluid. It needs to change with time as requirements come in, newly found requirements or discoveries along the way kind of dictate a change. And when that happens, again, it's always important to go back to, to take that step back and start at the, start at the finish line. Okay, who's getting content in what formats on what devices, and work your way backwards, and be able to fit those new requirements in and address them along the way. Taking a top-down approach at that point can kind of gum things up at the end stages. So being able to walk your way backwards through why you've created the strategy and find those points where the requirements come into play can really help you build and reshape the strategy as you go forward. And as you go, make sure you document everything, because as you make one change, you want to have that documentation available to justify that change, and also in place so that maybe 3-5 years down the road, when something else, some other new requirement comes up, you have a history of what changed and why, and can use that to further adapt your strategy going forward.
Great. Thank you, Bill. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. This will conclude today's broadcast. You'll be able to access the recorded version from the webinar archive section of our website, located at www.dclab.com. Our next webinar will be Tuesday, December 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Optimizing Your Data Content Model for Translation, presented by Amber Swope, Data Specialist of Data Strategies. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great day.